Everyone in Caldwell County thought Clara Whitfield had finally lost her mind. When the 19-year-old girl began draining the 80-year-old pond that had sat at the heart of her grandfather's farm for longer than anyone could remember, the farmers laughed. The elders warned her to stop, and the entire community watched with a mixture of pity and amusement, convinced she was destroying the most valuable water source on the property. But Clara wasn't acting on a whim. For 3 years, she had quietly studied that pond, noticing strange clues that nobody else paid attention to. The pond had been dug by her great-grandfather, Emmett Whitfield, in the spring of 1946, back when the land was still raw and the Whitfield family was trying to coax a living from the stubborn Kentucky clay. It was supposed to be a simple watering hole for cattle, a modest depression in the earth that caught spring rain and held it through the dry months. Over 8 decades, it had become something almost sacred. Children had learned to fish along its banks, their lines tangled in the willow roots, their laughter echoing across the water on summer afternoons. Her grandfather, Henry Whitfield, had proposed to her grandmother, Margaret, beside that pond in 1962, kneeling in the mud with a ring he had saved 6 months to buy. The old willow tree on its northern edge had dropped its silver-green tendrils into the water for 3 generations, and every summer, the surface bloomed with lily pads that drew blue herons from 3 counties away. The pond had saved the farm during the drought of 1988, when every creek in Caldwell County ran dry and the Whitfield cattle drank from its depths while neighboring herds perished. It had been the site of baptisms and birthday parties, and at least 3 weddings that Mrs. Gable could recall from her historical records. To the people of Caldwell County, that pond was not just water. It was memory. It was heritage. It was the beating heart of the Whitfield farm, and by extension, a piece of the county's own identity. So when Clara walked into Hendrick's Hardware on a Tuesday morning in late March, her work boots still caked with the red clay of her morning chores, and ordered 6 industrial sump pumps, 3,000 feet of reinforced discharge hose, and enough diesel fuel to run a small fleet of generators for 2 weeks, the man behind the counter didn't just look surprised. He looked genuinely concerned. His name was Frank Hendricks, and he had sold tools to 3 generations of Whitfields. He knew that Clara's father, Thomas, had passed away from cancer 2 years earlier. He knew that her mother, Linda, had moved to Nashville after the funeral, leaving the farm in the hands of a teenage girl who was still trying to finish high school when the world fell apart. Frank set down his pencil, removed his reading glasses, and asked Clara if she was sure she knew what she was doing. Clara looked him in the eye and said, "I need enough capacity to move 12,000 gallons a day, Frank, and I need the hose to reach the creek on the eastern property line. Can you get it here by Thursday?" Frank didn't answer right away. He picked up the phone and called her uncle, Robert Whitfield, who lived in a condominium in Louisville and hadn't set foot on the farm in 11 years. He called the county extension agent, Harold Pritchard, a man who had spent 30 years telling farmers what to plant, when to plant it, and how to irrigate it. He called Pastor Jim from the Caldwell County Baptist Church, who had baptized Clara in that very pond when she was 9 years old. By Thursday afternoon, half the county knew that young Clara Whitfield, barely 19 and fresh out of high school, was planning to empty the pond that her own family had protected for 80 years. The news traveled through the feed store, the diner, the gas station, and the church social hall with the speed of a summer storm. They said she had gone crazy with grief. They said she was trying to destroy the farm so she could sell it to developers. They said she had fallen in with some environmental group from Lexington that wanted to prove something about groundwater. None of it was true, But truth rarely mattered in a county where everyone had known your grandparents and had opinions about how you should live your life. They came to watch. At first, it was just the immediate neighbors. Old Man Tucker from the property to the east, a widower named George who had farmed corn and soybeans for 50 years, brought his aluminum lawn chair and set it up on the ridge overlooking the pond. He claimed he wanted to see what foolishness looked like up close, but Clara knew he was there because he was lonely and because the Whitfield farm had been the center of his social world since his wife died. The Miller brothers, Dale and Dwayne, who farmed 200 acres of soybeans on the south side of Route 42, drove their red pickup over and stood with their arms crossed, their matching ball caps pulled low, shaking their heads as Clara and two hired hands she had found through an online posting wrestled the first pump into position. Mrs. Gable, whose first name was Eleanor and who ran the county's historical society out of a converted Victorian house on Main Street, arrived with a clipboard, a camera with a telephoto lens, and a look of grim determination. She muttered about documenting the destruction of a local landmark before it was too late, about how the historical society might need to intervene, about how Clara's mother should be called home immediately. They laughed when they saw her wading into the shallows in rubber boots that were 2 sizes too big, borrowed from her father's old shed. They laughed at her dark hair, pulled back in a messy braid that was already coming loose. They laughed at her thin frame, dwarfed by the machinery she was trying to command, at the way she consulted a notebook covered in her own handwriting, at the serious expression on a face that still looked too young to be making decisions about anything more important than a prom dress. They laughed when the first pump sputtered to life on Friday morning, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the clean spring air, and began vomiting brown water into the creek that ran along the eastern property line. They laughed because the water was the color of weak coffee, thick with sediment and algae and the accumulated debris of 80 years. They laughed because she was 19, because she was a girl, because her father was dead and her mother had moved to Nashville, and there was no one left to tell her no. They laughed because it was easier than admitting that a teenager might see something they had missed. But Clara wasn't listening. She was watching. She had been watching for 3 years, ever since the summer she turned 16, and noticed something that didn't make sense. It was August, the hottest month on record in Caldwell County, and the pond had dropped lower than she had ever seen it. The waterline retreated from the willow roots by nearly 6 feet, exposing a band of cracked mud that usually stayed hidden beneath the lily pads. Clara had walked the perimeter out of boredom, kicking at the desiccated earth when she saw it. A stone. Not a field stone. Not a rock that had been tumbled there by a plow or a flood or the hooves of cattle. A cut. Rectangular. About the size of a brick, its edges worn smooth by decades of water, but still unmistakably shaped by human hands. It sat half buried in the mud, and when she knelt to brush the silt away, she found another one beside it, and another. They formed a line, straight and deliberate, running from the eastern bank toward the center of the pond. She counted 11 stones before the water became too deep to continue. She told no one. Not her father, who was already sick by then, spending his days in a recliner by the living room window, watching the farm he loved slip away from him while the cancer ate his strength. Not her mother, who was already planning her escape to Nashville, already packing boxes in the back bedroom while she pretended everything was fine. Not her friends from school, who would have thought she was imagining things, who were already drifting away toward college and jobs and lives that didn't involve staying behind on a dying farm. She simply noted it, photographed the stones with her phone, measured the distance between them with a piece of string from her father's workshop, and waited. When the rains returned in September and the pond filled again, the stones disappeared beneath the murk, and Clara began to wonder if she had seen them at all. But the following summer, during another dry spell that lasted 3 weeks, she found them again. And this time, she noticed something else. The water didn't just recede randomly. It pulled back from the eastern bank first, always the eastern bank, as if something beneath the surface was drawing it down with an invisible hand. The lily pads on that side died off 2 weeks earlier than the others, their roots exposed and dry while the western side still bloomed. The fish, which normally schooled near the center in a shimmering cloud of bluegill and bass, avoided the eastern half entirely, even when the water was deep and cool and full of insects. And on windless mornings, when the surface should have been glass and still, Clara saw ripples. Not the random disturbances of water striders or jumping frogs or the occasional turtle. Rhythmic ripples, almost like breathing. They pulsed from the eastern bank in slow, steady circles, one after another, as if something deep in the earth was pushing water up through a crack in the world. She spent her junior year of high school researching. She skipped football games and homecoming dances and Friday night drives to the quarry. She sat in the Caldwell County Public Library until the librarian, Mrs. Potter, began to leave the back door unlocked for her because she knew Clara would still be there when the lights were supposed to go out. She pored over maps that predated her great-grandfather's purchase of the land. She found a survey from 1843, drawn by a man named Elijah Crane, that showed the Whitfield property not as a single homestead but as a crossroads. There was a road marked on that map, a narrow line of brown ink that ran from the creek, across what was now the pond, and up toward the ridge where the old oak forest stood. The road had a name. It was called the Limestone Trace, and according to a dusty journal she found in the library's basement, locked in a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in 20 years. It had been the main thoroughfare for settlers moving west through Kentucky before the railroads came through in the 1880s. The journal mentioned a spring, a natural artesian spring that bubbled up from the earth with such force that travelers had built a stone basin around it, and later, a small inn had stood nearby to serve those who stopped to water their horses and fill their canteens and sleep in a real bed before continuing their journey westward toward the frontier. By 1890, the spring had dried up, or so the record said. A drought year, a shifting aquifer, and the Limestone Trace had been abandoned, forgotten beneath decades of sediment and farmland and the slow amnesia of progress. When Clara's great-grandfather bought the property in 1944, there was no pond. There was only a low, marshy depression where the spring had once been, a place that held water after heavy rains but dried to cracked clay in the summer heat. Emmett Whitfield had dug it out with a team of mules and a dragline scoop, deepened it, lined it with clay from the creek bed, and turned it into a pond. He had covered the old road. He had covered the spring basin. He had buried history beneath 8 feet of water and 80 years of silence, not out of malice, but out of necessity. He needed water for his cattle. He needed a pond. And the spring, which had been quiet for decades, seemed dead. Clara found all of this out 6 months before her father died. She sat by his hospital bed in the VA facility in Nashville, holding his thin hand, feeling the bones beneath the skin, and almost told him. She almost pulled out her phone and showed him the photographs of the stones, the maps, the journal entries. She almost whispered that she thought the spring was still alive, that she had seen the ripples, that she knew there was something beneath the pond that was worth more than all the water on the surface. But she saw the worry in his eyes, the way he looked at her, and saw the farm's uncertain future, the debt, the isolation, the impossibility of a 19-year-old girl keeping 100 acres alive. She saw the guilt he carried for leaving her alone, and when she kept her secret, she would wait. She would save her money from the part-time job at the feed store, where she loaded 50-pound bags of grain into pickup trucks for farmers who never remembered her name. She would learn everything she could about pumps and drainage and soil composition and limestone geology. She would make her plan in silence, and when the time came, she would act. Not on a whim, not on a hunch, but on 3 years of quiet observation, of noticing clues that nobody else paid attention to, of trusting the land to tell her what it had been hiding. The pumps ran for 3 days before the water level dropped enough to reveal the first secret. It was not the stones she had seen during the droughts. Those came later, higher up the bank, when the mud had dried enough to show their shapes. The first secret was the bottom itself. As the water receded, the floor of the pond did not look like a natural basin. It looked like a floor. The clay was too smooth, too uniform, packed down in a way that suggested centuries of foot traffic rather than the random accumulation of sediment and decay. Clara stood at the edge in her rubber boots, the diesel generators roaring behind her like angry beasts, and felt her heart begin to race in a way that made her lightheaded. The old farmers on the ridge didn't see it. They saw a girl standing in a muddy hole, wasting diesel and money and her family's legacy on a fantasy. But Clara saw the past surfacing. She saw the ghost of a road. On the 4th day, the eastern bank began to crumble, not from the water pressure, but from the weight of the saturated mud above it sloughing off in heavy, wet sheets that sounded like thunder when they hit the drying basin. And beneath that mud, something gray and solid began to show through. It was not rock. It was not clay. It was limestone, cut limestone, fitted together with mortar that had turned to powder over the decades, but still held the shape of the wall it had once been. The Miller brothers stopped laughing long enough to lower their binoculars. Mrs. Gable lowered her camera and took a step forward, her clipboard forgotten in the grass, her sensible shoes sinking into the soft earth. Old Man Tucker leaned forward in his lawn chair, his mouth slightly open, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. The wall was 4 feet high and ran in a straight line from the bank into what had been the deepest part of the pond. It was the retaining wall of the spring basin. It was the first proof that Clara had been right. It was the first crack in the armor of their ridicule. But the wall was only the beginning. As the pumps continued their relentless roaring work, the water dropped lower and the cost of the operation climbed higher. Clara had spent nearly $8,000 on equipment and fuel, money she had saved from 2 years of working double shifts at the feed store, money that was supposed to go toward college textbooks and a new truck and maybe a security deposit on an apartment in Lexington, where she could start a life that didn't involve mud and debt and the ghosts of her ancestors. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, calling from Nashville every Sunday, asking why she was throwing away her future on a muddy hole in the ground, asking when she was going to sell the farm and move somewhere sensible, asking if she had lost her mind just like everyone else was saying. The county extension agent, Harold Pritchard, drove out on the 5th day in his official green truck and stood at the fence line with his arms crossed, his jaw set, shaking his head with the authority of a man who had spent 30 years being right. He told her she was destabilizing the soil structure, that removing the water would cause the banks to collapse, that she was creating a drainage hazard that could affect the neighboring properties and flood the road during the next heavy rain. He threatened to report her to the State Environmental Board. He told her the county could sue her for damages. He told her she was too young to understand the consequences of her actions. The neighbors began to mutter, not just about foolishness, but about liability, about lawsuits, about a young girl who had no business meddling with forces she didn't understand. Dale Miller started telling people at the diner that Clara was probably trying to destroy the farm so she could collect insurance money. Dwayne Miller told his wife that he was worried about his own well water, that if Clara drained the aquifer, his crops would die. Mrs. Gable, who had been momentarily intrigued by the wall, returned to her original position, writing in her notebook about the destruction of a historical landmark and the irresponsibility of youth. The laughter turned to anger. The pity turned to suspicion. The community that had watched with amusement was now watching with hostility. The ridicule grew louder. The setbacks became harder. The cost climbed higher. Yet Clara refused to quit. On the 6th day, with the water down to ankle depth and the bottom of the pond exposed to the sun, for the first time in 80 years, she found the path. It emerged from beneath the eastern bank like a ghost rising from a long sleep, like a memory surfacing through layers of forgetting. The limestone slabs were gray and slick with algae, but their edges were still sharp enough to cut, still fitted together with the precision of craftsmen who had known their work would outlast them, who had built for centuries rather than seasons. The path was 3 feet wide and ran straight as an arrow from the spring basin toward the center of the old pond, then beyond, disappearing into the mud that still covered the western half. It was the limestone trace. It was the road that had carried settlers westward, that had connected farms to markets, that had been the artery of a county before anyone alive could remember. And it had been sitting beneath the water for 80 years, waiting for someone to remember. The farmers on the ridge stopped laughing. Mrs. Gable dropped her clipboard entirely and walked down to the edge of the mud, her eyes wide behind her thick glasses, her breath coming in short gasps. The Miller brothers drove their pickup closer, close enough to see the stones without binoculars, and Dale let out a low whistle that sounded almost like a prayer. Old Man Tucker stood up from his lawn chair for the first time in 3 days, his knees cracking, and walked down the slope with a pace that was almost reverent. But Clara didn't celebrate. She didn't smile or raise her hands in victory. She was already looking past the path, toward the western bank, where the water was still too deep, where the last pump was struggling against the mud and the sludge, where something else was waiting. Because the path was not the end. It was only the connection. The road had led somewhere, and Clara knew, with a certainty that had grown in her bones over 3 years of quiet watching, that the destination was still buried, still hidden, still holding its breath beneath the remaining water. She worked through the night on the 6th day, running the last pump herself because the hired hands had quit, scared off by the rumors and the threats and the exhaustion of fighting mud that seemed to have a will of its own, mud that sucked at their boots and their resolve with equal hunger, her own boots filled with water and then with sludge that weighed more than concrete, pulling at her ankles with every step, her hands blistered on the pump handles, the skin breaking and bleeding and breaking again until she wrapped them in duct tape from her father's old toolbox. Her back ached in a way that made her feel decades older than 19, a deep, grinding pain that started in her lower spine and radiated down her legs. At midnight, the generator coughed and died, sputtering out the last of its diesel with a sound like a dying animal. And she sat in the dark beside the silent pond, listening to the frogs that had already begun to reclaim the muddy banks, listening to the wind moving through the willow branches, wondering if she had come this far only to fail. The land seemed to hold its breath. The stars above Caldwell County were sharp and cold and impossibly bright, and Clara felt the weight of 80 years pressing down on her shoulders, the weight of every person who had ever told her she was too young, too small, too female, too foolish to understand what she was doing. But she was not acting on a whim. She had not come this far to turn back. She had not spent 3 years watching, learning, saving, planning, only to let a generator failure stop her in the darkest hour. She rebuilt the generator at 2 in the morning, her fingers numb from the cold, her mind running on adrenaline, and the memory of every clue she had cataloged in her notebooks. The way the water rippled on windless mornings, the way the fish avoided the eastern half, even when the water was deep and full of food, the way the ground had settled, not in a natural bowl, but in a shape that suggested something beneath it, something large and structured and waiting. She restarted the pump at 3 in the morning, and by dawn on the 7th day, the Western Bank had given up its final secret. It was not a treasure chest. It was not a vault of gold or a cache of forgotten weapons or the remains of some pioneer settlement. It was something far more valuable to a county that had been drying up for 20 years. Something that made Harold Pritchard drop his phone when she called him at 6 in the morning. Something that brought state geologists and hydrologists out within 48 hours. Something that made the Nashville news station send a camera crew to a farm they had never heard of. It was the spring, not the dried-up relic from the 1890 records, not the memory that had faded into county folklore, but the mother of it, the source, the beating heart that had never truly died. It had been buried beneath 8 feet of mud and clay and 80 years of sediment, choked by the weight of the pond that had been built to contain it, suffocated by the very water that was supposed to preserve it. But it had never stopped trying. For decades it had pushed water up through the cracks in the limestone, feeding the pond invisibly, creating the strange ripples that Clara had noticed on windless mornings. It had been breathing beneath the surface, pushing against its prison, waiting for someone to listen. And when the last of the mud was cleared away, when Clara knelt in the muck and scraped the final layer of clay from the stone basin with bleeding hands, the spring erupted, not in a violent geyser, not in a dramatic explosion that would have made a movie scene, but in a steady, powerful surge of crystal clear water that bubbled up from the limestone bed and filled the stone basin that the settlers had built 200 years earlier. The water was cold and sweet, tested later by the state and found to be some of the purest in Kentucky, fed by an aquifer that ran beneath 3 counties and held more water than every man-made reservoir in the region combined. The limestone trace, which Clara had uncovered, led directly to it. The road had been built not just for travelers, but for access. The settlers had known. They had built their inn and their basin and their road around a source of life that they had understood was precious, that they had protected with stone and mortar and memory. And then the world had forgotten and covered it with water and called it a pond and laughed at the girl who wanted to see what was underneath. The social reversal began slowly, then all at once, like a tide that had been held back by a dam and suddenly found a crack. Old Man Tucker was the first to approach her, walking down from the ridge with his lawn chair folded under his arm, his eyes wet with something that might have been shame or might have been wonder or might have been both. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't need to. He simply stood beside her at the edge of the restored spring, watching the water bubble up from the earth with a sound like music, and said, "My granddaddy used to talk about water that tasted like this. He said it came from the bones of the world." I thought he was making it up. The Miller brothers offered to help rebuild the stone wall, using their backhoe and their labor and their time for free, working with a humility that looked foreign on their faces, asking Clara questions instead of giving her advice. Mrs. Gable wrote a 20-page article for the County Historical Journal, not about the destruction of a landmark, but about the recovery of a lost road and a forgotten spring that changed the understanding of the county's pioneer history. She gave Clara a copy with a handwritten note that said, "You saw what history hid. Thank you for listening." Harold Pritchard, the extension agent who had threatened her with lawsuits and environmental violations, became the loudest advocate for using the spring as a model for groundwater management across the state. He brought professors from the University of Kentucky and reporters from Louisville and Nashville, and he always introduced Clara the same way, with a note of pride in his voice that hadn't been there before. "This young woman," he would say, standing beside her at conferences and farm shows, "saw what the rest of us couldn't see. She listened to the land when the rest of us were just looking at the surface. She taught me that the best solutions are sometimes the ones that require us to look backward before we can move forward." The farm changed. The pond was gone, replaced by a restored spring basin that fed a new irrigation system Clara designed with the help of the state engineers, using gravity and the natural slope of the land instead of expensive pumps. The limestone trace was cleared for 2 miles in either direction, becoming a heritage walking path that drew tourists and school groups and historians who wanted to walk the same road the settlers had walked, who wanted to kneel beside the spring and taste water that had been flowing since before their grandparents were born. The Whitfield farm, which had been struggling since her father's death, became a demonstration site for sustainable water management, a place where farmers from drought-stricken counties came to learn how to look for what was hidden beneath their own fields, how to read the signs that Clara had learned to read. She never went to college in the traditional sense, never sat in a lecture hall or wrote a thesis. She became something better. She became the person who had proven that the earth keeps its secrets only from those who refuse to look, who refuse to listen, who refuse to believe that the answers might be buried beneath the things they think they know. But the greatest change was not in the farm or the county or the tourists who came to photograph the spring and walk the old road. It was in the way the people of Caldwell County looked at their own land. They began to dig, not with machinery but with curiosity. They began to wonder what else had been forgotten, what other roads and springs and stories lay beneath the soil they had farmed for generations, beneath the ponds they had built and the fields they had plowed. Old men walked their property lines with new eyes, looking at the shape of the ground, the color of the clay, the way the water moved after a rain. Children were taught to look at the ripples on a pond, to notice where the fish schooled and where they didn't, to understand that the land was not just dirt but a library of stories written in stone and water and time. The county that had laughed at a 19-year-old girl for draining a pond became a county that listened to its land, that understood that sometimes the most valuable things are not the ones that sit on the surface, bright and obvious and easy to see, but the ones that wait beneath the mud, patient and quiet and eternal, for someone brave enough to believe they are there. Clara stood by the spring on the 1-year anniversary of the day she had started the pumps. The willow tree on the northern edge had survived, its roots now drinking from the clear water instead of the murky pond, its tendrils green and strong and silver in the morning light. She had rebuilt the stone basin with her own hands, fitting the limestone together the way the settlers had done, learning the old craft from a book Mrs. Gable had found in the state archives, feeling the weight of each stone as she placed it, understanding that she was not just building a wall, but rebuilding a connection. The water bubbled up from the earth, steady and eternal, and the limestone trace ran away from it toward the ridge, straight and true, a road that had been buried for 80 years and was now alive again, carrying footsteps instead of wagon wheels, but still connecting people to the source of life. She thought about her father, about the way he had looked at the farm with worry in his eyes, seeing only the struggle and the debt and the uncertain future. She thought about her great-grandfather, who had dug the pond not to hide the spring, but to save it, to hold water in a place that had been drying up even then, not knowing that his solution would become the problem that buried the real treasure. She thought about the 3 years she had spent watching, waiting, trusting the clues that nobody else had seen. The stones in the mud, the ripples on the windless water, the way the land had spoken to her in a language of patience and silence and subtle signs, teaching her that the world reveals its truth only to those who are willing to be still long enough to hear it. They had laughed when she started. They had warned her to stop. They had watched her with pity and amusement and anger, convinced she was destroying something valuable, convinced that a 19-year-old girl could not possibly know more than the generations who had come before her. But Clara Whitfield had understood what they could not. The pond was not the treasure. The pond was the lock, and the spring beneath it was the key. She had drained the water not to destroy the farm's heart, but to find its true pulse, the one that had been beating beneath the mud for 80 years, waiting for someone young enough to wonder, and stubborn enough to dig, and patient enough to believe that the earth would speak if only someone would listen. The sun set over Caldwell County, turning the spring water to liquid gold, and Clara sat on the edge of the limestone basin with her boots off and her feet in the cold, clear water, feeling the current push against her ankles like the earth itself was breathing, like the land was finally exhaling after holding its breath for 8 decades. The road stretched out before her, westward, toward whatever came next, toward the future she had built by uncovering the past. And for the first time in 80 years, the land was not hiding. It was speaking, and she was listening.